Okay, this is an overview of Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is the last of our branches of the criminal justice system that we're going to cover, and it's going to be the coverage of our correctional institutions. So let's get it right into the materials. Correctional agencies are responsible for carrying out the sentences imposed by criminal courts. So in the last chapter, we went through briefly the court process, judicial process, the various stages of uh, the legal system, the criminal justice legal system. And so now we've reached the point where let's say that the defendant has been processed all the way through to conviction, and now they're facing the issue of sentencing. So that now the correctional agencies become relevant. The federal government maintains its own correctional agencies, example, the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the U.S. Probation and Pretrial Services, as do each of the 50 states, usually through a state Department of Corrections. So, as we've seen with the other branches in the criminal justice system, you have multiple levels of corrections. You have your state corrections, which are responsible for punishments at the state level. For state level crimes, but you also have federal crimes. And we saw how a federal crime will be charged and prosecuted by the federal system. And the federal system also administers punishment for conviction of federal crimes. So two levels there. And let me add to that we also have county jails run by the sheriff that hold inmates temporarily on the more temporary short-term basis. So that's at the county level, even more local than at the state level. Counties and cities will also run correctional systems primarily for misdemeanor offenders from their local areas. Or if we're talking about jails here, not only misdemeanor offenders, but also offenders who are awaiting trial, who haven't been convicted of a crime yet, but who have been deemed sort of, it's been deemed necessary to keep them locked up while they await trial. So those are local areas. Sometimes you can see a city jail, but it's so the city might administer a jail, but most of the time, though, it's the county and the county sheriff who runs the jails. That's certainly the case around here. Corrections is an enormous industry in the United States. Total expenditures per year are roughly $100 billion. That's a lot. That is a lot. And so this is a big industry. Most of our students, just to let you know, most of our students their first thought for employment in the criminal justice system is usually not corrections. But keep in mind that there are lots of folks employed in probation, employed in probation and parole, employed in prisons, in jails, and et cetera, other organizations. So it's a big industry with lots of job opportunities, and it's something that students need to be aware of as they're looking around for potential career opportunities. This involves the supervision of close to 5 million probationers and parolees, around 1.5 million prisoners, and 750,000 jail inmates are incarcerated on any given day. So we're still in a period in current day America where we lock up a lot of people. And if you combine these two together, we have over 2 million people who are locked up on any given day, whether they be in prison or be in the short-term jails. So that's to give you a little more perspective. That sounds like an awful lot, but to give you a little more context, 2 million plus is less than 1% of Americans. There's 330 million Americans roughly in the United States. So 2 million plus is less than 1%. So it is 1 out of 100 who are locked up on any given day, less than 1 out of 100. The United States has a lot higher rate of incarceration than most other countries around the world. But keep in mind that even with our high levels, on any given day, it's in terms of percentages, is a small percentage of people who are locked up, less than 1%. This amounts to roughly 3% of Americans under some form of criminal justice supervision on any given day. So you might say, well, hold it, Professor, you just said it was less than 1%. So how's it 3%? Well, I was only counting people locked up in jail and prison. I'm not counting people who are under probation or parole. So who are under the supervision of the criminal justice system, but not locked up. If you add in all those folks, then we do have 3%. And that's something on the order of close to 10 million people on any given day who are under the supervision of the criminal justice system, either locked up or free in society, but still under the supervision of the system, on probation, on parole. The U.S. currently has the world's highest incarceration rate at around 750 people per 100,000 population. Russia's rate is about 600 per 100,000. England, Wales is about 150. So most countries have lower incarceration rates than us. And there's a couple of reasons for that. We do have, compared to other, at least wealthy countries, we have a significantly higher level of rates of homicide. And homicide is something that's going to get you typically a long stretch in prison. So we tend to, one of the reasons why we have a high incarceration rate is we have a lot of people convicted of homicide, higher than many other countries. That's one of the main reasons, or I should say at least one of the reasons, maybe it's not the main reason, but one of the reasons why we have such a high incarceration rate. We also have a higher rate of incarceration compared to a lot of poor countries because locking people up is very expensive. The typical inmate in the United States might cost the taxpayer more than $50,000 a year to lock up each person. Well, that's a lot of cash. It's a lot of money. And poor countries have struggled to be able to come up with that kind of money to be able to incarcerate lots of people. So ironically, one of the reasons why we have a high rate is that we have a lot of money available, funds available to lock up people we want to lock up. In many of these poor countries, they may have folks that they want to lock up, but they just don't have room. They don't have the cell space to lock up everybody who's broken serious laws, and so they kind of have to prioritize. And many people who arguably should be incarcerated are not. But indeed, we do have. It's concerning that we have such a high rate. It's estimated that 6.6% of Americans will eventually spend some time in prison. That's not counting jail. So if you look over a person's lifetime, of course, the chances go up if you're not looking at just one point in time, taking a snapshot, but you're looking at a person's entire life, which on average nowadays is close to 80 years of age. That's how come, because again, you might ask yourself, well, you said that there was less than 1% of people locked up, so where does this 6.6% come from? That less than 1% locked up at any given time is a snapshot just on any given day. But if we were to extend over a person's entire lifetime, then there's close to a 7% chance that you'll be locked up in prison. So that's significant, and it's higher than most other countries. And of course, it's significantly higher depending on which demographic group you're talking about in the United States. If you're talking about, say, for example, an Asian woman, an Asian American woman, the chances of over a lifetime of ending up in prison is very low, much lower than 6.6%. But if you're talking about an African American man in the United States, it's significantly higher than 6.6%. It could be, some estimates could be as high as, say, close to 20%. So it depends a lot. There's tremendous range. It depends a lot on which demographic group that you're talking about. While the United States has high homicide rates, our overall crime rate is not high. So unsafe streets at best only explain a small part of the incarceration levels. So we do have a serious violent crime problem. We also have a problem with gun-involved crimes where a gun gets used in a robbery, it gets used in aggravated assault, it gets used in a rape. Not often. These things don't always happen. Now, see, 40% of robberies are committed with a gun. Well, that's much higher than the rates in other countries where a gun gets used. And when a gun gets used, then the penalty tends to be much stiffer for a gun-involved crime. So that's also another thing that makes us unique compared to a lot of countries, is we have a real criminal gun problem in the United States, and that contributes to the high numbers of people who are locked up. But it is true that there's many crimes in the United States that are not high compared to many other countries around the world, at least the wealthy, industrialized kinds of countries. So the only area where we really stand out is homicide, gun-involved violence, um, and that's probably about it. Recidivism, that's a term you need to know if you don't know it already, a measure of how many former offenders reoffend in a given period of time. So you might have a study that'll say, what's the recidivism rate over a 3-year period of time? So what that means, over 3 years after inmates are released back into society, what percent of those inmates over the next 3 years end up arrested, rearrested again, or reconvicted again, or back into prison again? So there's different ways of how you measure it exactly, but it's something that we look at as a measure of sort of our success or lack of success of, okay, these people have served their time. How well do they do when they get back out there? And unfortunately, the research shows us that there's a disturbingly high percentage of inmates, ex-convicts who get released and within a few years are back into prison again. Those numbers are very troubling in that they're, depending on what study you're looking at, very often more than half of these folks within a few years end up back in prison. And if you look at recidivism studies that look at, say, over 10 years after you get out of prison, it could be 80 or 90% of these people, 80+% of these people who end up back in prison. So recidivism rates are a real problem and are much higher than we'd like them to be. Research indicates that given enough time, the vast majority of offenders will reoffend. Over a decade, if you look at 10 years after being released, more than 80% get locked back up again. Some reoffend by committing a technical violation. Now, this is a problem where when you do get released on parole, or let's say you're on probation, and so you're out of prison, you're not in prison, but probation or parole has a lot of rules. These conditions of probation or parole, that you can't drink possibly, or you can't use illegal drugs, or you can't associate with known criminals, gang members, you can't leave certain areas, go to a different state, that kind of thing. You got to check in with your probation officer, et cetera, et cetera. So you can break those violations, or you can violate the terms of that probation and end up going back to prison, even though you didn't really commit a serious crime or something. It's just that you broke the rules. And the philosophy behind that is, hey, we're giving you a break. We're not putting you in prison. We're leaving you out in free society, but just under supervision. So if you don't follow the rules that are part of probation or parole, well, then you are showing us that you're not making good enough progress, that you're really not conforming to the system here, to the way of the system. And so basically we don't trust you, so we're going to send you back to prison or send you to prison. So this is a common way that these people under the supervision of the criminal justice system end up in prison, is not just for committing serious crimes, but for committing these technical violations, which are not in and of themselves that serious, but do land a lot of these folks in prison. Corrections is typically divided into two areas: institutional corrections, and by institutional corrections we mean prisons and jails, and also community corrections, and by that we mean probation and parole. So you're not locked up, You could be in different situations where you could just be freely living in wherever you want to live, or you could be, they have sort of halfway houses. They have different arrangements that are kind of in between free and open society and being locked up. And so but those are called community corrections because it's not a jail or a prison. So the idea here is that you are somehow housed and living in the community, not in an institution in the sense of being a jail or a prison, right? So this is just an introduction where we're not going to get into stuff too deeply, but you'll often see criminal justice programs that will offer courses on institutional corrections. Spend a whole semester on jails and prisons. Spend a whole semester on community corrections, probation, parole, etc. So, of course, in this chapter, we're just only scratching the surface. A jail is a short-term facility, typically operated by the county sheriff. Important to know, because a lot of times we throw around, when we're talking criminal justice issues, we throw around terms loosely, but they do have a little bit more precise meaning. And jail means short-term, run by the sheriff. Jails hold accused persons who are waiting for trial, so they haven't even necessarily been convicted of a crime yet. They're waiting for trial, who were denied bail, were not given the opportunity to be free back into society while they await their trial. They were denied that. Jails also hold those convicted of crimes with shorter sentences. So you can serve out your time if it's a shorter sentence, less than a year, often for a misdemeanor. So you have different kinds of inmates in short-term facilities. And actually, there's a problem with that because you put a lot of these folks together, and some of them may be hardcore killers, and other people may be in there for some minor crime, some misdemeanor, some minor theft or something like that, and they may not be violent people, but could be housed, incarcerated. It could be in the same, cell, same area with very dangerous people. So that's one problem with jails, is that they're not built for long-term problems like prisons are, and so you get some of those kind of issues in a jail. A prison is a long-term facility operated typically by the state, so state prisons or also federal prisons operated by the federal government. Inmates are usually serving sentences of 1 year or longer, so these are more serious offenders in there for longer sentences. And these prisons are usually much better designed to handle inmates, to handle inmate issues than jails are. Jails are kind of almost more like a holding cell often. They're often not, so suited to the problems that inmates face, like mental health issues or activities, programming, things to do during the day. Jails are often not very good at that because the mentality is more, we're just holding you for a while temporarily, so we don't have to sort of make plans for long-term accommodations like they do at prisons. Okay, let's continue on in part 2.